Hello and welcome to Red May, where today's panel is on Kozo's theory of crisis today. Um, and as we're approaching the end of the month of Red May, we've got a few more panels upcoming. Tomorrow at the same time, we'll have There's No Such Thing as the Economy with Samuel Chambers, Cordelia Belton, Edouard and Soren Mao. And on Monday, we'll have a panel called Spectra Presents Ukraine Imperialism. And that'll be with Yulia Yurchenko, Ilya Mativ, Rebecca Carl, and David McNally. And we'll have our final film in the Miklos Jokovic series called Electra My Love for people who are in Seattle on May 31st at 7:30 p.m. at the Beacon. And we may have another panel as well, unannounced yet, featuring endnotes. Today's talk will be moderated by Gavin Walker, a critic theorist and historian at McGill University. Gavin also wrote an essay in this book, The Theory of Crisis Today, along with Ken Kawashima, one of our other speakers who translated the work. Before I hand it off to him, I'd like to make a quick pitch for our donations. We've got a GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May, as well as a Patreon. And there you can donate in order to help us keep this film festival going. And so without further ado, here's Gavin.
Great, thank you. Today we have really, I think, a very interesting panel dealing primarily with the publication of this book, Kozo's Theory of Crisis. This is originally a book written in the 1950s, but only recently translated by our comrade and panelist today, Ken Kawashima. So I'd like to really introduce first the speakers, and then talk a little bit briefly just about the format we're going to do. So the first of our speakers is the aforementioned translator of Kozo's Theory of Crisis, Ken Kawashima, who's associate professor in the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Toronto. He's the author of The Proletarian Gamble, Korean Workers in Interwar Japan from Duke University Press in 2009. He's the co-editor of Tosaka-jun, a critical reader from Cornell University Press in 2014. And he is the translator of this volume, Kozo's Theory of Crisis from Brill now, but soon to be available next year in affordable paperback edition from Haymarket Press. In addition to these things, he's also Sugar Brown, a blues musician, composer, and recording artist. I'm going to hand it over to Ken to talk a little bit about the book first. After that, we'll go to our next panelists, who I'll each introduce in turn. After that, I'll try to sort of say a few words to kind of bring these presentations together from all of our panelists who are involved one way or another with the work of Kozo. And after that, we'll have an opportunity to sort of hear from the audience and also take some questions more generally. Maybe I'll just introduce who we have else on the panel as well, for now, just so we know who's there. After Ken, we're going to hear from Wendy Matsumura, who is associate professor of history at UC San Diego. She's the author of a great book, The Limits of Okinawa, Japanese Capitalism, Living Labor, and Theorizations of Community, which was also published from Duke University Press. And she's currently working on a book entitled Waiting for the Cool Moon, Subterranean Struggles in the Heart of the Japanese Empire. And our last speaker of the panel is Richard Westra. Richard Westra is university professor at the Institute of Political Science, University of Opole, Poland, and international adjunct professor at the Center for Macau Studies, University of Macau. He's the author of many, many books, actually, in the sort of tradition of Kozo's theory of political economy. His most recent authored book is Economics, Science, and Capitalism, just last year, 2021, from Routledge. He's previously taught at a number of universities in Japan, South Korea, Thailand, the Bahamas, and Canada. So all of these speakers, one way or another, have been involved for a long time in Kozo's work, myself included. Ken, I think, is going to speak first as the translator of this book, and so therefore kind of at a level of really knowing this text in its minutia down to the periods and so forth. And Wendy has used Uno Kozo's work really extensively in her own kind of scholarship, particularly in the discipline of history and in the social history of the formation of Japanese capitalism, particularly around the so-called peripheries, although I don't think they can be called peripheries if they're the center of our research, particularly on Okinawa, that is the incorporation of Okinawa and the southern former Ryukyu kingdom into Japanese archipelago and therefore into Japanese capitalism. And finally, Richard Westra is widely known for his work, particularly in political economy. And I think that this, and the theory of political economy, even kind of epistemology or philosophy of political economy. And I think that this is really an important direction for us to take because, of course, this is also a way to see how in his work, Uno Kozo's theory of crisis has some sort of actuality today, since of course, none of us can claim that capitalism isn't in crisis today. So I think that all of these kind of different directions we'll try to bring together at the end of their presentations and then have a little opportunity for audience questions also. So without further ado, I'll hand it over first for the first presentation to Ken Kawashima.
Okay, thanks, Gavin, and thanks to Red May for organizing this panel. It's something I've been looking forward to for a long time, and I was wondering what to present on. I could talk about perhaps later in the discussion of why I translated this book, but I really wanted to just kind of jump into why I think why it should be read today, and what is the meaning of Uno's theory of crisis today. I mean, after all, it's a book that was written in 1953, but I think that it's a timely book for today because, especially since the 2008 crisis and amidst the present crisis of imperialist warfare around the world, we're clearly inundated by these dizzying proliferations of different symptoms of capitalist crisis, like the ecological crisis or the crisis of the health crisis of racism and fascism, the crisis of the welfare state, the crisis of war, and so on. And I just think that the question we need to ask is how are we to give ourselves clear direction for our thinking and for our politics amidst the present crisis of capitalism that is so complex and so overdetermined, and that can be very that can paralyze us in our thought and our actions. So it seems to me that what we all need is a kind of radical compass to give us orientation and direction to move forward, and to a compass to help us educate ourselves and society so that we never lose sight of the true reason for analyzing and interpreting capitalist crisis in the first place, which is to change the capitalist mode of production through revolution. And it seems to me that Uno's theory of crisis can give us a kind of radical compass through his theories, through his historical analysis, which can help us to renew the critique of capitalism and imperialism today. I think it helps us to fight against capitalist and neo-reformist forms of consciousness that are, to quote Lenin, too timid to dare to revolt, that are too enthralled by capitalist crisis itself, that behold capitalist crisis as some kind of spectacle of horror or fascination. It seems to me that Uno's theory of crisis helps us to critique three problems. For example, eclectic explanations over the cause of capitalist crisis, the interminable analyses of the sudden appearance of crisis, and it also I think helps us to fight a lot of unnecessary speculative prognostications, over the future recurrence of crisis. These are all problems, I think, of contemporary problems that tend to approach the existing conditions of capitalism as if they are permanent and eternal. Uno Kozo's theory of crisis smashes this kind of ideological nonsense and explains always how capitalist crises are signs of the impermanence of existing conditions of capitalism. Thus, his book minimally shows us how irrational it is to believe in the permanent necessity of these conditions of capitalism. So what I'd really like to talk about is a couple things. The basic thing would be Uno's theory of crisis and how it contributes to Marxist research today. And this he does, I will argue or discuss he gives us a theoretical demonstration of the inevitability and periodicity of capitalist crisis. But before I talk about that theoretical point, I think it's helpful to briefly review Uno's historical analysis of capitalist crisis over the entire course of capitalism's stages of development. And I think if we go over this very briefly, it will then give us a better understanding of why Uno wrote his theory of crisis versus, like a history book of crisis. He wrote a theory of crisis, but the theory of crisis can be makes more sense when we kind of go over Uno's historical narrative of the history of capitalist crisis. And he breaks this down into 3 stages of capitalist development: mercantilism, liberalism, and imperialism. And if we look at how he discusses mercantilism in the 17th and 18th centuries, we see that he discusses capitalist crisis basically as a financial crisis throughout the 17th and 18th centuries in Holland, England, and elsewhere. For example, the 1634 crisis in Holland, the so-called tulip bulb crisis, or the crisis of 1720 in England, the so-called South Sea bubble crisis. These are crises that were financial in nature, he argues, but these were crises that didn't really have a kind of internal drive inevitably appearing as such. They were mostly accidental. These were phenomenon of crises that appeared, as he says, on the surface of society. They were not driven or regulated by the reproductive process itself, which for Uno forms the basis of a single society. So he says that basically we've had crises since the beginnings of mercantilism, but they were very accidental and on the surface of society. That's the first stage. Then the second stage, he says, in between the 1820s and 1866, basically, he calls this the stage of liberalism. And basically, he discusses how from 1820 onwards, capitalist crises erupted consistently with a periodicity of 10 years or so, namely in 1825, 1836, 1847, 1857, and in 1866. And what Uno emphasizes is that when we look at these decennial crises, the recurring process was one in which a definite period of prosperity was followed by the appearance of an extreme degree of prosperity, and then it fell suddenly into crisis conditions. And then after the period of crisis itself, he says this process was always followed by a period of depression before turning once again to a new period of prosperity. So this is a really key stage of capitalist development for Uno, because he shows that in this stage, capitalist crisis becomes, in his words, inevitable and possessing a clear periodicity based on industrial capital, as well as we'll discuss more, the commodification of labor power. And I think the key point here is also that the repetition of crises during these 4 or 5 decades allowed Marx in Das Kapital to theorize capital's abstract movement of crisis in a theoretically purified way. And this is what Uno famously calls a purely capitalist society in theory. So this is the second stage of liberalism. But there's also a third stage of capitalist development, according to Uno, following Lenin, which is the stage of imperialism, which begins, we could say, after the 1870s and specifically after the 1873 crisis. And what Uno emphasizes here is that the periodicity of crisis, of prosperity, crisis, and depression does not change fundamentally, but new features start to emerge in the world of capitalism in the stage of imperialism. For example, with the rise of huge finance capital, the rise of huge fixed capital, for example, in the iron industry, what Uno emphasizes is that in the accumulation phase of depression, this phase tends to get dragged out and become chronic, which reveals the difficulties of selling off this huge fixed capital. And so what we see in this stage is inevitable crisis turning into chronic depression, chronic unemployment as a result, and we see the formation also of excess capital alongside surplus populations, which then become the ground out of which justifications for war become very powerful, for example, in World War I and World War II. So in this stage of capitalist development, we see capitalist economic crisis morphing into inevitable world war. And what's significant about this for Uno is that he believes that in this stage, capitalist society is no longer moving towards a purely capitalist society, but rather moving away from it. And, this is the question, where is it moving away? Where is it going? This is a question we should discuss. So this is a quick synopsis of just kind of a broad history of capitalist crises in terms of these stages of development. But what Uno wants to say is, we could make a history of capitalist crises from the beginnings of mercantilism all the way through liberalism and into the stage of imperialism. But, giving a history of all the crises of capitalism itself cannot explain why these crises necessarily erupted and appeared periodically and with an inevitability. So this is really where Uno wants to make his theoretical contribution. He wants to say, just studying the history of capitalist crises, which is very important, it helps us to, describe the beginnings of capitalism, and therefore it can help us describe the finite end of capitalism. But it cannot explain why these crises are inevitable, why they are periodically appear. So that's really what he wants to do in the theory of crisis, is to demonstrate theoretically, based on his reading of Marx's Capital, that capitalist crises is inevitable. And I would say that this is probably his raison d'etre to write the book, his primary reason, his primary argument, even his perhaps his primary rhetoric. He wants to make it impossible for people to say that capitalist crisis is not inevitable. He wants to say it's totally inevitable. And it also implies that he wants to go beyond theories of crisis that can only describe how capitalist crisis is possible. For example, when he has some critical words about Lenin's approach to crisis, and of course, Lenin often described capitalist crisis as, quote, the contradiction between the social character of production and the private character of appropriation. Now, Uno would say, of course, this contradiction is common to the capitalist mode of production, but he says that this contradiction only reinforces the possibility of crisis. It does not reveal the ground of inevitable crisis. So here, Uno then says, what is the ground? How can we describe the ground of the inevitability of crisis. And here is where Uno, I think, makes his most important point. He says that the inevitability of crisis is grounded in what he calls the fundamental contradiction of capitalist society, which he says derives from, quote, the commodification of labor power. And I think this is really, certainly for me, the most important point of the theory of crisis. And I think we need to I'd like to say a few words now about how the question of the commodification of labor power is for Uno the epicenter or the ground of crisis. So in many ways, Uno's entire theories of the fundamental principles of political economy revolves around this contradiction of labor power as a commodity. Because labor power, as we know, as Marx theorized in chapter 6 of volume 1 of Capital, labor power which inheres in our body, in our minds, as a potential to labor. Obviously, this is something that inheres in the somatic body of the worker, which capital cannot produce directly. At the same time, capital must consume our labor power as a commodity in the production process to extort all the surplus labor time to produce surplus value. So this contradiction, Uno really turns it into the basic contradiction or the fundamental contradiction of the capitalist mode of production. And it's out of that contradiction that he's going to theorize the inevitability of capitalist crisis. And in other words, he's also saying that capitalist crisis comes out of a very specific kind of weak point of capitalist society, which has to do with this commodification of labor power. For example, he writes, quote, "The commodification of labor power forms the fundamental basis of capitalist society. But since labor power is not originally produced as a commodity by capital, yet is transformed into one, labor power in this sense is the fundamental weak point of capitalist society." End of quote. So based on this contradiction, Uno then develops further how, because of this contradiction surrounding labor power, capitalist production tends to take on a peculiar form of expansion and then stagnation, and in a way that's very kind of difficult to understand by common sense. For example, he mentions, and so does Marx, of course, that in capitalism, a huge plethora or excess of capital in the form of commodities can exist alongside human beings, and yet a union between these things and human beings through the form of capital can be impossible. Uno says that this absurd, stupid, really, relation of excess capital alongside surplus populations is the way he would describe capitalist crisis. But his ultimate point is that this phenomenon of all this excess capital and all these surplus populations, which cannot necessarily find a union together through the form of capital, this is a phenomenon which represents the fundamental contradictions of capitalist society while resolving them practically. But this problem is grounded for him precisely in the commodification of labor power. And so, or in other words, the sale and purchase of labor power becomes such an important process for Uno and his theory of capitalist crisis. Moreover, for Uno, the commodification of labor power is, I would call it a kind of trigger mechanism for the entire vicious cycle of capitalist accumulation. And really, in chapters 1, 2, and 3 of this book, he describes each phase of accumulation, prosperity, crisis, depression, all based on this commodification of labor power. And he basically then describes each phase of accumulation and all of the aspects that take place in each phase. For example, in prosperity, where there's an expansion of production, an absorption of surplus populations, which triggers a rise in wages, the role of credit is very important in this phase, funding production, fueling speculation on the prices of commodities by commercial capitalists, which Uno says tends to conceal the tendency of the profit rate to fall. And then we have in chapter 2 the phase of crisis itself, when he describes especially the collision between rising interest rates from the banks and falling profit rates in industry, paralyzing the reproduction process and creating this phenomenon of excess capital alongside surplus populations. We see poverty in the midst of wealth, and as well as capital destroying its own value in crisis. And then lastly, the last phase of accumulation is the phase of depression, which is the topic of chapter 3, where he talks about the stagnation of the reproduction process, as well as how in this phase of depression, this is when we start to see improvements to fixed capital, in other words, improvements to the technical means of production as a condition for a new turn towards prosperity. So chapters 1, 2, and 3 really describe this kind of vicious cycle of capitalist crisis based on the commodification of labor power. And the overall sense of this cycle then is that crisis is inevitable. Even when we consider the highest points of prosperity, the sense of this narrative and exposition is that crisis is inevitable. It's around the corner, even at the best of times. So I'm going to wrap up very quickly now. I just wanted to mention what I think are some of the key special aspects of Uno's theory of crisis. So first of all, it's a book that rereads Marx's Capital to demonstrate how the phenomenon of capitalist crisis is grounded in the commodification of labor power, which leads to inevitable and periodic crisis. And therefore, Uno gives us a way to explain how crisis is never accidental or merely possible, but also inevitable. And I think it's important to emphasize the inevitability because it shows that the capitalist ruling classes are fundamentally incapable of managing all of the products of labor as capital. It shows that it implies rather that the necessity to revolutionize the capitalist mode of production. The second special aspect, as I mentioned very briefly, and which also distinguishes, I think, Uno's theory of crisis from other dominant theories of crisis in the Marxist world, he emphasizes capitalist crisis as a crisis of excess capital alongside surplus populations. And so it's not simply a theory that revolves around the problems of, for example, the tendency of the profit rate to fall, or theories of crisis about overproduction and underconsumption. He would say both of them are absolutely key to understand crisis, but they do not explain the inevitability of crisis. And the inevitability of crisis, he explains, is grounded in the commodification of labor power, which we should understand as the basic condition for profit rates to fall, as well as for overproduction and underconsumption. And the third and last point really is that Uno clarifies how overcoming capitalist crisis requires overcoming the fundamental contradiction of the capitalist mode of production, which is the commodification of labor power. And I think those are the three special aspects of his theory of crisis. And I think the last thing I want to say, what is the lesson then, or what are the basic lessons of Uno's theory of crisis? From this perspective, I think, and this is something I've talked about and worked on a lot with Gavin, and I'm sure he could say also a lot about these things, but what I've learned is that when we think of capitalist crisis, it's about the commodification of labor power, which makes us realize that the analysis of this process of commodifying labor power should be understood as, to use Gavin's word, as a vector of politics. as a vector of subjectivation, as a vector of resistance, and indeed as a vector of revolution. In my research, through Uno's book, I was able to analyze the process of the commodification of labor power as, for example, as a process of disciplinization, or as a process of racialization, of colonization, of gendering, and warfare. These are all aspects of that process that have to be overcome in revolution. And the last point really for Uno and for us, I think, to think about is that when we consider the necessity of revolution, when we consider the necessity of the revolutionary transition from a capitalist society to a communist society, Uno wants to say we should look at this question of transition from the perspective of negating, abolishing, and overcoming this process of the commodification of labor power. And to use Uno's words from his text, Capital and Socialism, he writes, "The planned economy and socialist movements should begin precisely on the basis of the abolition of the process of the commodification of labor power." So that's what I think is kind of the main lesson of Uno's theory of crisis. And there's obviously a lot more we can talk about, but I'm going to end it here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ken. A lot of points to discuss in a lot of different ways. Now I want to turn it over to Wendy Matsumura, who's our second speaker. We'll talk from her own perspective about Uno's theory of crisis.
Hi, everyone. Please let me know if the sound is, if you can't hear me. So thanks so much to the organizers of the panel and to Ken for providing us with this occasion to talk about Uno Kozo's thought and its relevance for our current conjecture. So I've been given the task of talking about history, and my starting point really will be or is Gavin and Ken's note in their essay that accompanies Ken's translation of Theory of Crisis. And this is something that Ken already talked about, but that Uno's importance lies in his demonstration of the, quote, historical necessity of crisis, which then allows us to think otherwise about the necessity of capitalism in our everyday life. The class and other struggles that were waged by folks who understood that the necessity of crisis was inextricably linked to their ability to interrupt the apparently smooth space of capital can provide those of us, sorry, these are my words, who think about the so-called past with openings for organizing from within the cramped spaces of capital's inability to directly produce labor power as a commodity, which, as Ken just said, is a central contribution of Uno's theory of crisis. And so I was not sure what I was going to, what I had to contribute to this panel. So because my co-panelists know a great deal more than I do about this particular text, I wanted to talk more about my own work on Uno that focuses mainly on his writings on the post-World War I agrarian question. And my recent work on these writings arose out of a really simple kind of technical question, which is that what consequences did Uno's uncritical use of data that came from the Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce in his understanding of differentiation in the countryside have for the kinds of anti-imperialist revolutionary struggle that he could imagine? And this is really a question about why he and others accepted these data sets, which were, from my perspective and from the perspective of groups like the Japan Farmers Union, products of an imperialist worldview meant to enact a particular reality of the metropolitan countryside. And as I started to think about this question, and as I began to read works written by Caribbean thinkers like C.L.R. James and Sylvia Wynter, which were driven by my own present, I began to wonder if the uncritical use of a particular data set that collated the results of self-reported ledgers kept by small farm households was symptomatic of a larger problem that needed closer study, not only in relation to Uno, but in relation to other pre-war Japanese Marxist theoreticians who participated in the debates on Japanese capitalism. So I'll start with James's writings that situate my own thinking. So in Beyond a Boundary, he discussed cricket as an avenue for Trinidadians to become socialized into the manners and sentiments of their British colonizers, as well as a path to entry into low-level colonial bureaucracy. Sylvia Wynter, in her reading of what she called the Jamesian poesis, argued that his novel Minty Alley made clear his commitment to understanding and ultimately undoing the colonial reality at hand, a move that was reflected in its illumination of the infrastructure of global accumulation within which Trinidadian society existed. It revealed the deeply rooted nature of subjugation and dehumanization, within which characters that appear in it, like Matthew Bondsman and others who might otherwise be defined as colonial lumpen proletariat, were imbricated. And these were conditions that required more, Wynter argued, than a critique of the labor-capital relation from which many would have been altogether excluded. For James, clarifying or resolving the so-called labor question in the colony required understanding how the global mode of domination, inaugurated by the slave trade, was transformed but did not disappear with the commencement of free trade. Wynter called James's method of seeing the category of the human that was founded during the Middle Passage's transformation of enslaved persons from Africa into pieza, or an abstract unit of measurement, quote, based on the estimated productive capacity of an able-bodied, usually male slave of a certain height and size, the piezo-conceptual frame. While this conceptual frame begins from the claim that the value of a commodity is always already based on a, quote, societal definition of the value of that labor according to the social value ascribed to the bearers of particular variants of labor power, Wynter focused on the fact that the superiority of European man as human, as she called it, depended on their ability to claim their position as the bearer of free as opposed to enslaved labor. By the time the Japanese state commenced its own imperialist policies in the second half of the 19th century, this framework, as well as the related notion that colonialism brought with it civilization and development, was widely shared and articulated by a variety of European thinkers. Ideologues of the Meiji state, as well as their critics, depended on the same categories, concepts, and models of value and accumulation that effaced centuries of enslavement, genocide, expropriation, patriarchy, and exploitation in European political thought and philosophy. As Cedric Robinson outlined in Black Marxism, these categories work precisely because by the time they were adopted by national and colonial bourgeoisie outside of Europe, local contexts, mediated by methodological nationalism, allowed differences to float as abstractions free from particular histories. Specificity could be read as evidence of national belatedness, a narrative that was hegemonic in interwar Marxist debates over the character of Japanese capitalism. Not only did Japanese intellectuals and bureaucrats not situate the significance of older forms and relations as they were mobilized in service of the construction of a new socius, within regimes of accumulation that extended globally, they adapted and translated the conceptual logics that underpinned Wynter's European man as human into and became sort of abstractions of an abstraction that supported mid-19th century justifications for imperial expansion. Recent work on Hokkaido by scholars like Michael Rollinghoff and Kazumi Hasegawa and others show that both abstractions exerted their violence from the moment of the Japanese nation-state's formation. Scholars Sidney Liu and Azuma Eiichiro show that neutralizing verbs like shokumin, ishokumin, takushoku, or kaitaku that masked the ontological and epistemological violences enacted and enabled in its name aided the subsequent forgetting of the Meiji Restoration era as a time of colonial violence and dispossession. And these were rooted in early Japanese colonial studies thinkers' definitions of labor. So I'm talking here about folks like Nitobe Inazo, Yanai Tadao, and Yamamoto Miyono, that equated free labor with human dignity and enslaved labor with depravity. The violences required to inaugurate the nation-state form remain uninterrogated in this schema, which relied on but kept dispossessed indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans as always outside of definitions of the former. Uno was acutely aware that the post-World War I crisis was inextricably linked to multiple empire-wide political crises that required the mobilization of state violence. As he and others tried to formulate critiques against the state's counter-revolutionary responses to these interlocking crises, one area that they focused their energies on was the question of feudality as a system or sentiment that posed an obstacle to the development of revolutionary thought in the metropolitan countryside. Uno's writings noted that Japanese agriculture was caught in an irresolvable dilemma after the World War I agricultural recession. Capitalist countries, including Japan, with a large agrarian population, had to reform, quote, all aspects of agricultural life because of a global turn to autarky, quote, embedded in the political necessity of securing the fate of agriculture in the metropole. He argued that imperialist competition required states to more carefully coordinate agrarian spaces throughout their empires rather than relying exclusively on an imperial division of labor. This messiness actually disappears in his writings on the agrarian question. Uno argued that the key to understanding the so-called agrarian question lay in correctly assessing the historical and political significance of the coordination of the the consolidation of the small farm household that borrowed and owned land or aspired to own land in order to fully utilize its household labor. He referenced data presented in the Noka Issei Chosa, which was a nationwide survey of farm households, to explain the key role that the figure of the jikosaku, or part owner, part cultivator, played in Japanese agriculture. Quote, they cultivate half of our country's arable lands and manage 55% of tenant lands. They occupy a unique position. For Uno and other Marxist theoreticians who were trying to diagnose the post-World War I conjuncture, the predominance of small peasantry who were willing to work themselves to the point of exhaustion in the hopes of becoming part owner cultivators or owner cultivators constituted a stubborn obstacle to the emergence of revolutionary thought and action in the countryside. Their drive to survive, instead of capitulating and becoming tenant farmers or workers in the cities, made it difficult for Uno to envision the unfolding of the material conditions that he believed was necessary for the organic emergence of a revolutionary consciousness. Uno was not hopeful that this would happen, given the persistence of feudality in thought, sentiment, and customs. We see this in his treatment of small farm households' use of hired labor, in an essay called No-gyo no Kosei that focused on the category of extrafamilial labor, so kazokugai no rodo. At first glance, the data that he summarizes from the Imperial Agricultural Association's 1935 survey of agricultural management seems simply to provide support for his overall argument, which is that because small farming households were not able to overcome agriculture's seasonal surpluses or labor shortages on their own, but were also not able to abandon agricultural production altogether, they had to rely on temporary paid and unpaid extrafamilial labor. He explained that many ailing small farm households increased their reliance on, quote, helpers, a category of extrafamilial labor that was part of a system of village mutual aid that had preceded the modern era. The problem with this was that while the communal work on the farm household that had its roots in the old mutual labor exchange relations intensified, it was no longer a passive reciprocal relationship based on village reproduction, but was part of an aggressive labor-saving technique used by increasingly atomized small farm households. I think here, one of the interesting but I think crucial questions that Uno did not ask was the question of which peoples and communities were granted access to this reconfigured village community that offered the possibility of this kind of communal work in the first place, and which was necessary in order to enact policies that Uno admitted were politically necessary but economically impossible. What labors were not recognized as such, even in a moment that was characterized by the ministry's drive to surveil, classify, and calculate all labors in unprecedented ways. Expulsion from the commons, whether they took the form of forest lands or mutual labor exchange agreement that provided access to these aforementioned helpers, was a constant for many families in metropolitan agrarian villages that did not fit the bill as potential conquistador humanists. Who became suppliers of extra familial labor power to what degree? Who was newly recruited to fill this role after massive outflows of young men and women from agricultural work to factory work? What tasks were counted as labor that was worthy of monetary compensation, and who was permitted entry into the community were constantly negotiated high-stakes matters of survival, though the data sets that marked changes to the categories of agricultural labor had no room for these historical dramas that were unfolding throughout the empire. The revolutionary or anti-colonial consciousness that those who were expelled from this reconfigured national village community, I would argue, went largely uninterrogated in Uno's work on the agrarian question. And so that's kind of the consequences of that is really kind of what I'm interested in looking at. However, his work on crisis suggests that it is crucial that we examine these manifestations of as Kawashima and Walker write in the aforementioned essay, quote, capital's fundamental inability to produce labor power as a commodity directly, if we want to interrupt its self-narrative as self-perpetuating and internal. And part of sort of the thing that I'm interested in looking at is the way that it's capital, but also it's the nation that kind of presents itself in the similar way as self, kind of as eternal and as not necessarily unchanging, but as somehow kind of not in need of interrogation. So yeah, I guess that's all I have. I mean, there's a lot there's a lot, I think, that Uno has to offer. And what's been kind of difficult to reconcile for me as a historian is like how to actually think about the historicity of his own work and sort of the things that maybe he was not looking at, while at the same time kind of really understanding the value that his thinking has to kind of analyze, I guess, the same sort of society that he was trying to change. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. Many thought-provoking and important points about particularly the whole historical question of the commodification of labor power, which is a sort of phrase we see in Uno all the time, but which is rarely actually in his own work expanded in its full sort of historicity. So next, I want to turn it over to Richard Westra, who is our third speaker about Uno's theory of crisis. And without any further ado, I will pass it over.
Okay, great. Thank you. Listen, I'm really happy and honored, actually, that Ken invited me to this, to participate in this discussion of his book and then to participate in this Red May. I guess it's kind of a left festival of sorts. And so I think I'd heard about it, but I'd never actually got involved. So I'm very happy that Ken called me on this one. Also, I wanted to say that I think that Ken has done a great service to Marxist theory by translating this important book, The Theory of Crises. And I mean, it's not simply a service to Kozo Uno and to the Uno approach, but I think it's a service to Marxist theory. And I think that Marxists all around the world should read it and appreciate the contribution that particularly not only of Uno's work in general, but definitely of Uno's work on this specific question of the theory of crisis. What I want to talk about takes a step back a little bit from what other people have been discussing And it's a step that really can be looked at as a kind of a foregrounding of what we're discussing. And the foregrounding I'm referring to is related to questions of science, the philosophy of science, questions of ontology in theory making, epistemology and ontology and the fit between these, questions of methodology and epistemology and ontology. And I want to say, first of all, that, of course, look, there's all sorts of differences between the natural and social sciences. But when we talk specifically about science in any strong sense, what we're talking about when we use the term science, or we should be talking about this when we use the term science, is what we should be talking about is the fact that science is all about truth. It's all about attempting to produce objective knowledge, or knowledge that's as close to the truth about some particular object, theoretical object of science as possible. And when we use the idea of scientific laws, people always talk about scientific laws. Again, yes, they're different in the natural world than they are in the social world. But at the end of the day, if we're going to use the term scientific law, whether we're talking about a law of the natural world, or whether we're talking about the law of value, or whether we're talking about the law of crises, what we're talking about is that we can say that the truth of a law is demonstrated when it holds in a closed system. And in this closed system, the mechanism that the law designates works itself out unimpeded, or with an iron necessity, as Marx put it. If that is the case in a closed system, then we can talk about the truth of scientific laws. We can talk about the usefulness once we say, well, we've established that this law is true. It's worked itself out with an iron necessity. It's worked itself out under conditions of a closed system where it's able to work itself out unimpeded. Then we can talk about the usefulness of laws. And what is the usefulness of laws, whether, again, in the natural science or in the social sciences? The usefulness of laws for us is when they help us explain particular events, particular happenings, particular states of the world, when they help us explain this in open systems. And this open system can be the world as a whole. This open system in the social world can be in human history, but it helps us explain these events happening, particular states of the world. It helps us explain these under conditions where, first of all, the mechanism often does not get things all. Excuse me. And second of all, that the mechanism was found operating alongside other mechanisms. So yes, in history, in the natural world, yes, laws can be shown to work in experimental situations. And I'll get to the whole question of social science and how social science can create the closest analog to some kind of experimental situation. But at the end of the day, once we move into open systems, whether we're talking about open system of the natural world, the open system of the universe, the open system of human societies, and the open system of human history with all its humming and buzzing, when we're talking about questions of open systems, then these laws, no matter how strong they are, at the end of the day, they're always going to be found operating alongside other laws, and these laws themselves causally empowered by other mechanisms. So that's one thing I wanted to say about science quickly. Another thing I want to say is that when we look at the world, first of all, again, whether we're talking about the natural world, whether we're talking about the social world, we're looking at a world that's very deep and structured. And the structures of this world are its deep causal mechanisms. And these deep causal mechanisms, of course, when we look at the world, there's quite a large variety of these deep causal mechanisms. So we can also say that the world is not only composed of deep structures, but it's also stratified. And this stratification, of course, when we use the term stratification, what in fact we're referring to is what the object of the various sciences are. So the object of sciences like chemistry is, of course, that element of stratification that refers to the chemical composition of the world, of the universe, of nature, of human beings, and so on. And when we refer to if we refer to physics, again, the same thing applies. If we refer to a science like economics, again, the same thing applies. We're talking about some particular ontological strata that we believe we can produce knowledge of, and that this knowledge that we're producing of it is going to be true. And so, and the question of the deep structures, the question of stratification, this has huge, huge implications for our epistemology or and our methodology, or sometimes I'm going to use the term cognitive resources. When I refer to cognitive resources, I'm referring to our epistemologies, our methodologies, and so I think everybody here knows if we talk about epistemology, we're asking a basic question: hey, how do we know something? And that's the epistemological question. If we talk about ontology, well, we're asking that question: is what exists? What's out there? That's an ontological question. And methodology, to me, is all about the logic. It's all about the particular form of analysis. It's all about potentially the framework of analysis within the context of some particular epistemology and within the context of ontology. But at the end of the day, I, and not only me, but others would argue that it's always ontology that is determinate. So we can't talk, not in any scientific sense, we can't talk about, oh, Marx employed this epistemology, Marx employed this methodology, this logic, et cetera, in Capital. I don't think we can talk about that in any serious scientific sense until we're fairly clear on what Marx is talking about. And that precisely is the whole question of the ontological object. And of course, nothing irks me more than reading these long books where people are debating dialectics and people are debating other epistemologies without the slightest reference to what the particular object of theory is, the particular object in the real world that these epistemologies, that these methodologies are adopted with reference to producing knowledge of. And so I don't think we can even, and to me, when we begin to talk about cognitive resources, completely neglecting what these cognitive resources are devoted to with respect to our explanations, with respect to what we want to know truthfully about the world, to me, this is the basest form of idealism, where you can simply talk about how we might know something without any reference to what we think there is to be known and what there is to be known. And of course, in trying to match our cognitive resources in a very clear way with the specific ontological object. So let's get back to Marx. So Marx, you pick up Capital, and Marx, he refers to his work in Capital as the founding or basis, a foundation or basis of a new science. And Marx is also fairly clear. He distinguishes his science as a social science. And he does that by saying, look, in the natural sciences, we can do this, we can do that. But in the social world, in the study of economic phenomena, we have to do this. And of course, Marx, why did Marx his work in Capital as a new science? Well, he viewed it as a new science precisely because he believed that it was studying a relatively new emergent ontological object. And this relatively new emergent ontological object was capital, or the capitalist mode of production. And of course, for Marx, why he referred to his book rather than, or titled his book rather than the capitalist mode of production or capitalism, et cetera, is he entitled it capital precisely because he believed that the ontological or causal mechanism of the capitalist mode of production was capital. And so that's and then of course there's all sorts of confusion about this too. So he subtitled his book The Critique of Political Economy, and I think that's very, very important. But again, a lot of the debate around this, and you know what, I can leave some of this for the questions because all the time I'm picking up books that some of them that wax very, very lyrically for hundreds of pages about how Marx was not doing economics. He was not studying capital. It was all a critique of political economy. And then I say after, whoa, could you give it a break a bit? And I say, well, if he's actually critiquing something, what is the basis? What is the basis of his critique? What makes what Marx says about some other approach true and what the other approach says is false? So of course we can think of critique in the sense that, well, I'm like a lab scientist, and I put on my white jacket and I walk into the laboratory that's completely sterilized, and I try to get rid of everything in my mind so that when I conduct an experiment, I make some observation, and this observation captures without any of my own biases what really happened in this experiment. So in this sense, one way is this trying to find some sort of Archimedean point in which we're sort of outside something, and we're trying to outside a process, outside history, if you will, outside nature, where we're trying to examine what it does. So that's one way. And some people say, well, look, Marx was a socialist. So the fact that he was a socialist, that made him right, and that made bourgeois political economy wrong. But I don't think Marx was so simple. In fact, I know Marx was not so simple, and Marx certainly was no fool. And we need not be made fools, thanks to Marx. And so why Marx referred to his work as a new social science? And again, someone might say, well, what was bourgeois political economy doing? Weren't they studying something? And I would go, yes, bourgeois political economy was studying something, but they didn't quite know exactly how to deal with it, right? Because the bourgeois, first of all, the bourgeois political economists, whether it's Adam Smith or whether David Ricardo, even though the main ones anyway, even though there's some fundamental differences between them, at the end of the day, they were essentially touts for the bourgeois system. They, Ricardo, his big thing was, free trade. Adam Smith was that capitalism's really in us. We go way back to rude society, and people trucked and bartered from the day they walked out of caves, and so that this genetic predisposition is carried all the way over into modern society, and somehow capitalism just sort of helped us realize what our genetic makeup was. And so they even though they were studying, and again, I'm going to get to why they necessarily, and I emphasize necessarily, had to study capitalism. So they're studying something. Of course, it had to be capitalism, but they're studying it on a very superficial level. They're studying it in terms of its phenomena. They're studying, Ricardo really drills down to its sort of phenomenal forms, its system of prices, and how the price system works. And then, of course, the later vulgar economists and the neoclassical economists, they've completely lost it, and they're not actually studying anything. They're just trying to use calculus and the margin principle to track these infinitesimal movements, which they design according to some sort of schema of how they understand how this thing called the market works. But it's completely ahistorical. In fact, the neoclassical prices have nothing to do with capitalist prices. Neoclassical models have nothing to do with a capitalist economy. But again, Marx was no fool. So Marx is studying. He says, even though yes, he's working through the cognitive resources of his day, which is bourgeois political economy. These, and in fact, all science does that. All science necessarily has to begin by working through a given set of cognitive resources. But where science becomes revolutionary rather than evolutionary is science fixates on how these cognitive resources leave some ontological object essentially unexplained. That there's this ontological object, it's doing things. These cognitive resources may be attempting to make some sort of sense out of it, but they just can't for various reasons. And so in order to really make some sense out of this ontological object, in this case is capital, you needed a new science. And so, of course, for Marx, the bourgeois political economists is they essentially, yes, they had to be theorizing capitalism. Just give me a minute, I'll get to why they necessarily had to be theorizing it. But at the end of the day, they didn't really appreciate that this was, in fact, a new emergent ontological object, and that capital was a very powerful, deep, causal or generative mechanism. And so, in a sense, they naturalized capitalism, as Adam Smith does. Capitalism's in us. It's part of our genetic code. We truck and barter. Voila. Next 4 centuries later, or 4 millenniums later, or 2 millenniums later, we naturally are going to gravitate towards capitalism, and there's no way out. And so this was bourgeois political economy. But again, Marx was interested in precisely what was the cause, what was the deep structural cause of these phenomenal forms that the bourgeois political economists worshipped, that the bourgeois political economists were mesmerized by, and that they wanted to they wanted to make a sense out of them, but not any kind of deep sense, but a kind of a sense that would help these phenomenal forms develop and grow. So they thought about what would be the best policies to support the further strengthening and the further playing out of these phenomenal forms that they grasped empirically. So the question now is, well, it's a new ontological object. And of course, the next question goes, why? What was the ground upon which Marx made that determination that we have a new ontological object? It's a new causal power. And so, in fact, today, and this is something also that I find rather amusing, is people cite, almost every heterodox economist in existence cites Polanyi. And they talk about, well, in the capitalist era, the economic or the market society tends to disembed from the social. Somehow it tends to levitate from the social to constitute a separate sphere. So you find this in some Marxists like Resnick and Wolff, that, capitalism constitutes a kind of a new, with the economic disembedded, it's a new sphere of society that didn't exist before. People like Heilbronner referred to this sort of economic society, that capitalism bequeaths an economic society. And the economic society, even though it's never completely an economic society, it's an economic society in the sense that for the first time in history, the economic tends to kind of levitate outside of the social. It tends to disembed or separate, from the politics, from the religion, from the culture, from the magic, from the mysticism, from all of these other social practices. And so for Marx, the question is, well, look, the very basis for this new science is precisely the fact that the ontological structure, or the ontological, or the causal force, or the ontological force of capital, it is that precisely which is what makes what these later economic historians and later heterodox economists are describing. That's what makes it appear to levitate from the social, to separate itself as a separate sphere from other social practices. What Marx, as a genius, long before Polanyi, he argued that, well, what makes the appearance of the economic to emerge or levitate from the social as a separate sphere is precisely the objectification of social relations. And so it's this objectification of social relations, or the reification or the self-abstraction of social relations, that Marx claims is the foundation for him beginning to think very, very carefully and marshaling a fairly novel set of epistemological and methodological resources to uncover this process. And of course, all Marx was doing, and he never at the end of the day consummated his project. But what he was attempting to do was simply to do what capitalism in history was already doing. Capitalism in history was already disembedding, was already separating from the social. It was already constituting a separate sphere. Its objectification of social relations was already, in a sense, not only disembedding from society, but coming to wield society, to manipulate society for its own self-aggrandizement, which is the augmentation of value. So in a sense, if we look at it in a very abstract way, we could say, well, capitalism is a society in which our human life, our human material life, is reproduced as a byproduct of value augmentation, which is what capital fundamentally is all about. And it's only because honestly, think about it, sit down and think about it, drop all the labels and this and that you might have to refer to things, and just think about it, that if capitalism did not have this tendency, if capitalism did not have this tendency to disembed from the social, if it did not have the tendency to objectify human social relations and convert them into relations between things that take on a life of their own, as Marx poetically put it, if it did not have that actual historical tendency, economic theory would be impossible. And so Uno comes along, of course, and for Uno, he learned about, as he said himself to some of his students who, because I didn't know Uno personally, but I've known some of his students, and his students relayed this to me, that Uno got all of his economic knowledge just from reading Capital. He lived with Capital day and night for decades. Yes, he went to some, he was in Germany, and he went to some of the, I got a few more minutes and that's it. Okay, I'll close up. So he went to, Uno went to Germany, and yeah, he studied with some of the big guns at the time. Of course, Uno read German, he spoke German, so he read Marx's Capital in German. And of course, what struck Uno, of course, and Uno would be the first to agree that Marx's Capital was really the first attempt to create this new science. And so Uno saw himself as simply finishing what Marx had started. And again, for the same ontological, the same historical, the same reasons that Marx believed that what he was doing was simply following the ontological motion of the object as it divested itself of other non-economic, non-capitalist practices in history. Marx believed he was doing that, and Uno simply refined that procedure. And I think Uno's clearest, and this is what one thing I liked about the book, and I'm going to write a review for it, for a review of Radical Political Economics. They were the ones that sent me this book here. And when you go to chapter 5 and you look at the inevitability of crisis in capitalist society, in fact, in that chapter, and this is the first time I read this book, of course. I've known Ken for a very long time, and I'd known he was working on this. A few times I kept saying, hey, Ken, when is it coming out? And then, I don't know, he must have been struggling somewhere. And he never answered my emails for a few years. And then finally, and what a great achievement. But in that chapter 5, what Uno does is precisely sort of give a little bit of a summary of exactly those scientific principles that I just elucidated, but in his own words. And so when Uno does that as a way of explaining why he developed Marx the way he did, on the basis of how he understood what Marx himself was doing. Cool.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Richard. Tons of actually things to talk about, and I think that there are some sort of interesting correlations we can kind of put together, in the sense that we sort of have two already kind of interesting directions amongst all of these talks. In Ken's sort of summary of the project of Uno's theory of crisis has an interesting intersection with what Wendy is talking about the sort of historical dimensions of the commodification of labor power. And it reminds me that whereas Richard is talking really principally about the methodological and the sort of epistemological orientation of Uno's theory of crisis, which is founded on Uno's methodological orientation in general towards this object of analysis, which is capital. And I think that methodological analysis in Uno is a really important part of actually the theory of crisis, as he just pointed out. In part because Uno at the time, I'm sort of coming to this as a sort of intellectual historian, so I'm interested in what Uno was doing at various times. And shortly after writing this book, Uno writes a very, very influential and important article in the journal Shiso, or Thought, in 1956, called on essentially on method in the study of political economy. It's a very kind of it's a very famous article of Uno's, in which he really kind of talks in precisely this way about what it is that he's doing. And he's very fond in that article of quoting Marx's famous line from, I believe it's the second edition of Capital, in the introduction, where Marx says, in the analysis of economic phenomena and economic science, chemical agents and laboratory microscopes are of no use. For us, the force of abstraction must replace both. And this is a very, very interesting thing, where Uno then takes from that and he says, our force of abstraction is precisely this, what Uno called the level of pure theory, or the theory of a purely capitalist society, or what he called the level of principle. And he says, this is our experimental apparatus, this level of principle. I think that's really an interesting and important thing, because Uno's theory of crisis is so devoted to kind of charting an interesting path in relation to other crisis theories. Many Marxian economists who read it will inevitably say, but where do you situate yourself really here within the nature of profitability and so forth? Where does Uno situate himself within relation to the question of demand and capital accumulation? But in fact, Uno's part of Uno's argument is to situate what he's doing on a more kind of ontological level of crisis, to say that crisis is an ontological component of this object of analysis that is capital. It's actually so fundamental that individual crises, where they should be analyzed historically, but of course, he would never deny there is such a thing as a crisis of overaccumulation, for instance. But he says, when you find historically a crisis of overaccumulation, it doesn't mean that that's an explanatory device for understanding why crisis is necessary for capitalist society. That only tells us historically why this crisis has happened. Or even it only tells us what one effect of crisis could be. And Uno is very keen on this to say that in the theory of crisis and in the history of crises, we are very frequently confusing cause and effect. What happens to cause crisis at the fundamental level, he claimed, was this condition of the impossibility, or that can even be a assumption, but the entire set of questions that surrounds the commodification of labor power and capital's inability to fundamentally do this. And I think that's where there's this interesting connection to also what Wendy is saying, that actually in the history of capitalist development, and we have to remember that Uno's work itself came out of this very interesting back and forth with the history of capitalist development. He was also a certain kind of economic historian, in fact, writing on all sorts of things, the Chiso Kaisei land reforms in the Meiji period. He wrote a very, very interesting texts on the history of sugar industry, for instance, in the colonies. I think those are texts Wendy was sort of referencing there. He wrote extremely interesting texts actually on the theory of the Nazi economy. Those, again, are very, very important texts for today. I think that what's interesting there, and it's a point of kind of, sort of red thread amongst all of these discussions, is the idea that actually, in order to get at some kind of fundamental understanding of the newness of capital as a kind of ontological object that has made the world in its image, if we will, at that level of the history of populations, how the commodification of labor power has historically taken place, that level of history and the level of theory that tells us what the fundamental nature of crisis is, that are always kind of intersecting and always kind of sort of bisecting each other, even though, in Uno's view, methodologically, we have to keep them separate in order to understand actually how they function in our world. I think this is a really kind of important aspect of the theory of crisis, and I think I want to echo everyone who said that I think Ken has done a really, really important thing for us, not just for translating kind of, this guy we're kind of interested in from the 50s who wrote about Marx and wrote about, political economy and so forth. It's a much more important book than that, I think, because, it's really, Uno is not talking about the theory of crisis in Japan. He's not talking about the history of Japanese capitalism, although that's in the background somewhat. But he's talking actually about how we can understand crisis at all, and in turn, how we can understand capital at all. Because for Uno, capital is fundamentally bisected by this necessity of crisis, right? He has this very interesting phrasing, actually, in the later essays on crisis that followed this volume, that actually Ken and I reference in our piece and have talked a lot about, where Uno comes up with what he calls three necessities, right? And he says these correspond to the levels of pure theory, the level of the stadial or sort of stage development of historical forms of society, mercantilism, liberalism, etc. And then one stage which is essentially the conjunctural analysis of our present. And he calls these three necessities the necessity of crisis, the necessity of war, and the necessity of revolution. He says the necessity of revolution is something that's just a present drive. We know it because our society is overwhelmed globally with imperialism, racism, war, plunder, deprivation, etc. But that necessity of revolution is a subjective comportment. It can't be proven on the level of theory. You can't prove that it's necessary to have revolution. You have to convince people at the level of a subjective political comportment. At the level of history, war is necessary because we live in a world of nation states, as we know today, right? And we live in a world of competing geopolitical interests. At the level of pure theory, the geopolitical interest is axiomatically excluded. We're talking about the self-development of the object of capital. And there, Uno says, beware the simple kind of explanation from the historical level that says, here's why crisis is happening. Crisis occurs because this form of society organized around the form of capital has an inevitable, unavoidable flaw, which is located around the commodification of labor power. And one way or another, this is extremely politically, theoretically, and historically rich as a kind of vein of analysis. So I would like to maybe pose a couple questions to all of you that have been passed to us from some of the viewers who are watching this. And the first one, I think, is again a very, very important question from the history of crisis theory. So as many people know, one of the sort of really dominant texts, I would say, in the history of crisis theory in the English language at any rate, has been the very famous article of Anwar Shaikh in '78, the Introduction to the History of Crisis Theories, in which Shaikh essentially argued that there are two camps of crisis theory amongst heterodox economists or Marxists. One centers on demand, in which it's assumed that demand drives capital accumulation. The second camp centers essentially on profitability, as profits are assumed by these figures to drive capitalism forward. How would any of the presenters situate Uno's crisis theory in relation to this typology, where the former, there's one that essentially focuses on consumption and one on production? Would anyone like to, Ken or Richard or Wendy, like to take this on, the relationship? Where would we situate Uno's theory of crisis in relationship to this kind of schema of Shaikh, where there's the demand centered crisis and the sort of profitability centered crisis?
Well, I could just say a few things, and I would then probably want to hand it off to Richard, who probably can speak more about this. But I mean, just as a kind of simple way to look at Uno's theory of crisis, as I was trying to suggest, I think a lot of these theories of like Sheikh's work on the, also on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, that analysis of crisis is really focused on in the sphere of production. And then we have other theories of crisis, for example, Lenin's stuff from 1895, or Rosa Luxemburg's stuff on the realization crisis, the realization of value when a commodity is produced and yet cannot be sold. It cannot realize the surplus value and therefore cannot realize profit. That is an approach to crisis that really takes place in the sphere of circulation and accumulation. So we have, on the one hand, the falling rate of profit approach, which is really based in production, for example, in a factory. And then we have another theory that's really kind of in the sphere of circulation. And what I would say is Uno's theory of crisis is kind of between them, or the way I think of those two approaches to crisis, it's kind of like, what they have in like, what was it, psychology, like the Ludin's vase, like you have two faces that are looking at each other, and you either see two faces or the outlines of a vase, right? I kind of see those two approaches like a Ludin's vase. And I think what Uno wants to say is there's actually this repressed problem that allows both of these approaches to look at each other, as it were. And that's this question of the commodification of labor power. Or to put it differently, when we think of the relation between the sphere of production and the sphere of circulation, Uno wants to say we can only think of the relation between these two because of this process called the commodification of labor power, or what Marx called the sale and purchase of labor power. And the problem that Uno, I think, was dealing with was many Marxists, of course, know about the question of labor power. They know that this is one of Marx's most important categories and concepts to contest the ideologies of the bourgeois political economists who only talked about labor, but never labor power, right? I think what Uno wanted to do was to say to fellow Marxists, I know we all know about labor power, but we need to formalize this problem theoretically to give the place of the commodification of labor power a prominent theoretical place so that we don't assume it or simply take it as a given. And to see this process as the generative process out of which we see problems of the falling rate of profit. In other words, the commodification of labor power is the foundational process that allows capitalist production to produce surplus value. Without the sale and purchase of labor power, there's no exploitation. There's no division between socially necessary labor and surplus labor time. There's no distinction between absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. All that stuff are derivative effects of the primordial process where labor power is sold and bought as a commodity. That's what Uno wants to say. And he wants to say that, so therefore, when we talk about crisis and its inevitability, he wants to say, let's make sure we don't forget what is the kind of primordial, I call it a kind of triggering mechanism of the capitalist mode of production and its relations and forces of production. Those are based for Uno on this originary problem or originary contradiction surrounding labor power. So in that way, I mean, the way I see Uno's theory of crisis, it's alongside theories of overproduction, underconsumption, which is in circulation and accumulation, and it's alongside theories of the falling rate of profit, which is really based in the production process, the sphere of production. And he's trying to give us also a more total way to approach these two approaches to crisis by talking about the commodification of labor power. And that's how then he also can try to contribute to a different perspective on the theory of crisis, where he really emphasizes excess capital and then this whole question of surplus populations, the law of populations. It's something Uno really, I think, developed in a very robust way. That's, I think, very important to his theory of crisis as well, the theory of the law of populations.
Does anyone else want to touch on that question, the relationship of Uno's crisis theory to other crisis theories? Richard, yeah.
Sure. I mean, first of all, I don't like this reference to the tendency of the rate of profit. Sometimes it's referred to as the law of the tendency. Like, I don't know what people are talking about. As I said, a law is a law. You can, the truth of scientific laws is demonstrated when they hold, when the mechanism that they refer to is able to work itself out in a closed system with an iron necessity, as Marx put it. Then we can talk about a scientific law. And so part of the problem of Marx's exposition in the third volume of Capital, and why people have reverted and developed this whole idea of the law of the tendency of the blah, blah, blah. And there's different expressions of this, but all of them to me are nonsensical laws, is that basically Marx introduced factors into it. He introduced precisely some of those historical factors that you and Ken argued that Uno believed might be used to explain one or another crisis, but not necessarily crisis in its most fundamental sense. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The second thing is you talked about the force of abstraction, Gavin, in the beginning of your discussion. And, in science, we use abstraction as a tool. So we always say, well, I'm going to, even in the natural sciences, they use abstraction, and we use abstraction to isolate some kind of element or to isolate some kind of mechanism. So it's abstraction goes on everywhere in the science. That's not what Marx was talking about. Marx used force of abstraction. And by force of abstraction, what he was referring to is precisely this ontological tendency of capital to objectify, to self-objectify, to self-reify, to self-abstract human social relations. So the whole question of crises, of course, follows from this force of abstraction, and the force of abstraction in itself. And this is why Uno referred to the motion of the object, because the motion of the object, and this I think was a very, very fundamental point of Uno, and a huge contribution to Marxist thinking, but also to later philosophy of science debate, particularly in debates over critical realism, and that Uno, in fact, was very, very prescient in the sense and being a forerunner of what some of these arguments about ontology are, and some of the strongest ones for ontology, precisely looking at this force of abstraction. So, and the force of abstraction helps us explain the ordering of concepts and the development of concepts within the context of the theory. So if we look at volume 1 and volume 2, in volume 1 and volume 2, Marx is dealing strictly with value categories. And so with value categories, it's impossible in value categories for there to be some kind of disproportionality. So I think Luxemburg was wrong about trying to say, well, in volume 2, she started playing around with these reproduction schemas and said, oh, something can't balance. That's actually impossible, because under value categories, there can be no disproportionality, and everything, all exchanges are equal exchanges. Labor power exactly receives the value of labor power, which is set at its the cost of its reproduction, and so on. And also a very important point. So one, because you're dealing with value categories in volume 1 and volume 2, you're also assuming a kind of an equilibrium. You're kind of assuming that supply and demand will meet. You're also assuming, and you're not problematizing, the commodification of labor power. In fact, you're not problematizing any commodity. In volume 3, and this is what Uno would refer to as the doctrine of distribution, there all of a sudden you begin to problematize commodities, the different commodities, the different technologies that are necessary to produce these different commodities. And once you begin problematizing commodities, you got to problematize the commodification of labor power. And that becomes so yes, in the beginning, when he's starting to develop the argument, the force of abstraction, he's following it in to develop the price system from in relation to the value system. And so I don't want to get into debates about that, because that's not the main point. But the main point relates to the question of crises and the commodification of labor power, which in this book. And where that issue arises precisely is in the context of the way, not only, first of all, the different commodities that capitalists are trying to produce pose some difficulties for capitalism, because all of a sudden their use values have some kind of revenge effect in the fact that capital would like to produce use value as value without any recognition of its sensuousness, of its qualitativeness, of its difference, and so on. And so all of a sudden, in the context of capitalist competition, in the context of the division of surplus value amongst different capitals, there now you start to see use value beginning to pose problems. But of course, capitalism resolves these. But as it's resolving these, all of a sudden, number one, use value begins to pose this is the biggest game changer for capitalism. And that's precisely its ability to maintain labor power as a commodity. And so it's when you get to that point, then you can begin talking about capitalist crisis. And of course, because labor power is the one commodity that's responsible for producing every single other commodity, then once you have a problem with the commodification of labor power, you have a problem with capitalism and its ability to produce every single commodity that it wants to produce for the abstract purpose of augmenting mercantile wealth.
Absolutely.
I would also say, if I could just quickly, I mean, one thing about Uno's theory of crisis that I thought was so unique and so different is the way he reads volume 2 of Capital. he doesn't really engage with the reproduction schemas because he only looks at it to talk about the turnover time, the kind of temporality of circulation, which I think is very important. But he also criticizes a lot of Marxist theories of crisis that rely on the reproduction schemas precisely because those schemas only talk about the products of labor, you know. And Uno wants to say, yeah, but in other words, the reproduction schemes of Marx even assumes labor power as a given. And what Uno wants to say is we can't just simply assume it as a given. We have to actually analyze how it becomes a commodity. So he has, I would say, a kind of resistance to theorizing the inevitability of crisis by relying on the reproduction schemes. He rather looks at volume 1 and volume 3 more.
I think there actually, Ken, you make a really good point where both Richard and Ken, you know, there, because there's something really interesting about Uno and Uno's prescience today, in fact, when so much analysis is devoted, and I think actually Wendy's kind of historical investigation is very closely related to this point, that there, when Uno analyzes the reproduction schemes, he says something very, very interesting. He said, basically, the reproduction schemes ignore actually the most fundamental sphere of reproduction, which is the reproduction of the commodity labor power. And that level, that kind of level of reproduction, that's a little bit, you know, where Wendy's talking about this whole question of what's excluded when we utilize the data set that basically presupposes who constitutes a kind of worker in the household, right? Already there's a kind of first order elimination of the most fundamental question of reproduction, which is how kind of both the commodity form of labor power, and then in fact those who can never be given or can never commodify their labor power. After all, we should remember Marx's famous quip that the only thing that's worse than having your labor power commodified is not being able to commodify your labor power effectively, because you need to be able to eat in capitalism. You know, I think that this is, again, like, it shows a very, very interesting kind of thread connecting all of these. I want to bring in a couple other points from the audience, some questions that they've asked, such as, for instance, what role Uno's reading of Hegel's logic plays in the mechanics of Uno's crisis theory. I don't know if Ken, you want to touch on this question of Hegel here, but certainly Uno was very, very fond of the one famous line of Lenin in Lenin's notebooks on Hegel's logic, where Lenin says, even if Marx did not leave us a logic, as in sort of the style of Hegel, at least he left us the logic called capital. In other words, Uno saw that in capital was, as of course many others have done historically, in capital was a kind of logic. It was not a book principally of method, but there was a method that could be derived from capital, not just at the level of imitating the investigation, but a relationship to the object, a kind of new transformation of a scientific grasp of the object, as Richard pointed out. Does anyone else want to talk about Hegel in relation to crisis theory? Go ahead, Richard.
Sure. I mean, look, the issue, I think probably Marx, Uno, and others were more astounded that Hegel could develop a dialectic, and some would argue that maybe in fact Hegel's whole dialectic of the absolute was Hegel believed that I mean, I think this is hugely important, and this is one of the issues I sort of touched on but didn't expand on in my discussion of epistemology and matching epistemologies with ontologies, is that the dialectic is not just some kind of method that we can say, oh, here's my list of methods. which, why don't I use the dialectic today? It's not that. The dialectic is a content-specific method. The dialectic, you need, in order to use the dialectic in any scientific sense as a very specific epistemology, you need to have a particular kind of object of thought. And that object of thought must be self-abstracting. It must be self-objectifying. It must be self-infinitizing. It must be self-reifying. And so for Hegel, the absolute to him was all of those. And so Hegel constructed all of these concepts based on the absolute. You know, Hegel wasn't an idealist because he didn't believe in the existence of the real world. He did believe a real world exists. That's not what made him an idealist. But what made him an idealist was the fact that he simply believed that what was true was the absolute, and that the real world was sort of this repository of all sorts of problems and contradictions. And so he believed that knowledge had to become pure, and that at that point, when knowledge became pure, then we could begin to talk about scientific truth. But he only believed he could apply the dialectic because he believed the absolute actually was operating dialectically by self-revealing all of these pieces of philosophy all through the ages. So for Marx is not very helpful in the beginning of Capital when he starts talking about, oh, Hegel had the dialectic on its head, I turn it right side up. He's not being very helpful because and again, it may just be he feels he has to explain this to a certain audience, and so he leaves it at that. But the actual fact of it is that Marx actually saw Capital as operating dialectically. He believed that was the real materialist incarnation of the dialectic. That was Capital, that it was a material, necessarily because the dialectic would be realized in history, but it was a materialist dialectic because he was following the actual material tendencies of the object in history, and Uno's job was simply to consummate it and to organize it in ways that he saw that had some sort of homology with the division of chapters and categories in Hegel's logic. But its actual fact, it was the object that was doing the dialectical abstraction. This is the force of abstraction, Gavin, that you referred to, and this is why Marx deployed the dialectic, and Uno simply, in my view, refined it. And then later it's been refined even more by scholars like Sekine. But they couldn't refine it if the object itself did not have some sort of dialectical structure, and its concepts could not emerge and interrelate dialectically. So let me...
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's a really, really, really crucial point. And, the relationship of Uno and Hegel is this whole interesting thing. He left all these, as you said, these kind of, interesting things, these manuscripts where he kind of writes the categories of capital over the categories of the logic, and then he crosses things out and puts new ones in. And later interpreters, of course, have really, including Tom Sekine and so forth, have really developed this aspect. I wanted to just also mention here, Wendy has a question, a very, very interesting question for Ken. I was wondering, Wendy, if you want to just pose your question maybe to Ken, because I think it's great, and I'd like maybe if you want to just jump in and mention this whole point.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a point so much as an actual question, but I was reading, not the introduction, your preface to the translation, and it's just a thing that you say in passing, where you note that labor power could be interchanged with human ability to work or labor capacity. And then you have a quote by Marx that references sort of, we mean by labor power or labor capacity, the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in the physical form, living personality of a human being, capabilities which he sets in motion whenever he produces a use value of any kind. And the reason why I sort of was interested in asking you kind of whether Uno actually uses these phrases in the text and if he distinguishes between them is really just because, I've been kind of trying to read about this labor capacity, but it's usually sort of juxtaposed to a different concept called just labor efficiency. And sort of and there are sort of interesting ways that people who are working in sort of these agricultural spaces as well as in colonial spaces are differentiating between those two and using them kind of for different sets of people. So this caught my eye because I wasn't really aware of, ability, capacity, efficiency, capability, these seem to be quite different terms. And so I was interested that, you thought they could be used interchangeably.
I think they can be. I think Marx pretty much used them interchangeably, but I think another way to think of it also, is, and what Uno, I think, helps us think about is to rethink this whole concept of labor power and the contradictions surrounding labor power as a commodity. But the basic, I think, or the significance of the concept of labor power for Marx, obviously, is that it's very different from labor. Labor is the activity of working. Labor power is a capacity or ability, or I would say a potential to labor. But it only is realized, labor power is only actualized in laboring. So that's, I think, and then it gets to the other question of how, for Marx, how labor power is reproduced. And I think this is also at the center of Uno's theory of crisis, to think about how labor power has to be reproduced. It has to, consume means of subsistence on a daily basis, means of subsistence, food, clothing, shelter, housing, and so on. But it also includes education and training. It also implies then possibly making children and so on for a next generation of workers. So labor power or labor capacity, I think, implies all these things for Marx, and I think Uno wanted to emphasize those aspects as well.
I think one thing is also really interesting about Wendy's question. There's of course like a philological answer to this too, that Marx doesn't actually use the phrase Arbeitskraft until Capital, but prior to that, he talks about the same thing under these other terms, Arbeitsvermögens and so forth, like labor capacity or labor potentiality. But all of this, as Ken pointed out, I think it's the really crucial thing. This relates also to Richard's discussion, is that Marx wants to distinguish between a kind of historical teleological activity, labor, literally the act of doing some kind of historical action in the world, and labor power, which is actually something that is theoretical. It's not present. You can't find the labor power next to the spleen in the human body. It's literally something that when labor power is exchanged as a commodity, only then, for this brief second, does labor power really actually have any materiality. It's made to exist by this act of being purchased effectively. Prior to that, it doesn't exist. If I go to the local shop and say, I'm willing to work for 5 hours, and we negotiate the fee for my ability to work for a definite period of time, it's not as if I can go home and say, I've still got that labor power right here, right in the stomach or whatever. I don't, it's only this thing. So I think Marx is just really trying to, and Uno as well, trying to emphasize in a way, this interesting thing is, as Richard pointed out, when I was saying this thing about the force of abstraction, it's Abstraktionskraft, right? It's like the force of this abstraction. It's the same term in labor power. It's the force of labor, right? Not the overall working population, but it's kind of theoretical force. And I think that that's really important. Uno really ascribed so much importance to this differentiation between labor and labor power. That, well, Wendy, of course, you know this because, you've been, so much of your work has revolved around this kind of question as well. But I think it is an interesting question. I mean, is it the same thing? I mean, I think that if anything that there sort of is to really flesh out in Uno's kind of discussion of labor power in all these texts is, I don't know, we really have to kind of all work somehow on talking more about what this really weird thing labor power actually is, because it's a very, very fundamental question to the nature of capital, and especially to Uno's work. It's where, he famously called it the mantra of capital, right? The commodification of labor power, like a prayer that we would say or something to learn capital well. I think it's the centerpiece. It's the thing that drops out so frequently in a lot of other discussions. Uno could be seen to sort of like, repeat this ad nauseum, but I think we kind of need that ad nauseum today when this point drops out quite a lot, that this is something we're talking about that's fundamental, and really foundational, primordial. We are rapidly approaching the 2-hour mark. And I'm wondering whether we should, anyone would like to say a last brief thing or so. If not, I think we could all just congratulate Ken on the publication of this super volume. If you don't want it in the rather pricey Brill version, within 1 year, it'll be out from Haymarket and paperback at a reasonable, humanly affordable price. And I really strongly recommend this book. I think it's also the product of a huge amount of work by Ken. It is not, having done it also myself, it's not at all an easy task to translate Uno's work. And Wendy knows that too. She's also translated lots of Uno. And so yeah, on that level, I think we could all just say, thanks, Ken, for doing this. And it's a repository of a lot of important knowledge.
Thanks, man.
Okay. Thanks so much, Gavin, Ken, Richard, and Wendy for that fascinating panel. And thanks to all of our viewers. Consider donating to Red May at GoFundMe or Patreon. Hopefully we'll have live events next year, and we'll need funds in order to fly people out. And definitely watch our upcoming panels. We have 2 left in the month. Tomorrow we'll have There's No Such Thing as the Economy on Samuel Chambers' book. And on Monday, we'll have a panel on Ukraine, Imperialism, and the Word Economy by Spectre, featuring Yulia Yushchenko and others. And watch our past broadcasts as well on YouTube. Thanks, everybody, and see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.